Now you're all in for a real treat, because one of the best editors, writers, thinkers that I know in this country, she happens to be a global force, is Gillian Tett, who's chair, of course, of the editorial board and editor at large for the U.S. of the Financial Times, and a great friend of mine. Gillian, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Steve. And I should say thank you for moderating such an incredibly important panel before, which really lays out what we're going to talk about now, which is we've heard these harrowing stories about the desperate need for more PPE and the problems with the supply chains and the efforts that congressmen and representatives are trying to make to actually get some of those problems addressed. We've heard a lot about the DPA, but hand on heart, I think most of us are pretty confused about what the DPA actually is and where it's come from. So we now have two fantastic experts who are going to answer all the problems, all the questions you ever had about it, both about what it means in terms of the current situation between the federal government and the states, but also in terms of what it means for some of the history, where it came from. So I'd like to start by turning to the first person we have on the panel, which is Professor Abbe Gluck from Yale University, who's a legal professor, who's been looking at these issues. She's really primarily in the medical side, but now looking at these issues too. And then afterwards, I'm going to ask Professor Brinkley, Doug Brinkley, who's a historian, a very esteemed historian from Rice University, who can set this whole thing in a historical context. So first of all, Professor Gluck, can you tell us why this matters? Why does the DPA matter? And who is actually in charge of it? Is it the states or is it the federal government?
So thanks, Gillian. Great to be here. Let me start by just saying that everyone should realize the DPA is a really old law. It is about 70 years old, but most people have never heard of it. And that's because until now, it's really been used primarily for the military. But it allows the government to get around the normal functioning of the economic market to get goods that it needs in times of national crisis. So FEMA uses the DPA all the time for things like bottled water and hurricane disaster relief. The current White House has used the DPA hundreds of thousands of times already in this administration alone for military needs. So it's new in this context, in the public health context. So what does it do? The DPA gives the president a lot of authority over products and lets him get around the normal functions of the market. He can tell companies to prioritize our federal contracts. He can give companies extra financial incentives to make products. He can tell companies to work together when they normally would not be allowed to because of our antitrust laws. And he can bypass the lengthy and cumbersome procurement process that we normally have to do to buy goods. So it's powerful, it's important. So why aren't we better at it now, given how much experience we have in the military context, and what are the controversies? Let me just take a minute to try to lay that out a little bit. First of all, as I said, it's relatively new in the public health context, but we should be better because we have an awful lot of experience on the military side. Second, there's a general view, especially among the Republican Party, that these kinds of exceptions to the normal functioning of the market are unusual. They should be rare. And the president has been saying that over and over again as a reason not to invoke it. Third, why can't fantastic senators like my senator, Richard Blumenthal, who you just heard from, why can't he step up and just order these goods? The reason is the DPA doesn't give Congress that authority. The DPA puts it all on the president. It tells the president he has the authority. Congress can push the president. They can pass other amendments to give itself more authority. You just heard the senator say we should have a sort of a czar in charge of this process, but Congress can't just order the production of the masks itself in this same way, and neither can the great governors out there that are working so hard to protect our citizens. They don't have that power either. Governors have an enormous amount of emergency power, but there are some federal laws that assume there are situations in which we need a national coordinated response. That's what the DPA is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a centralized response, someone in the middle in the midst of a nationwide economy that crosses states that will be able to command the control of products and send them where they need to go. And this is exactly the kind of emergency in which it should be called for. So let me just make 3 more points. 1, it was not invoked early enough here, okay? One of the reasons it was not invoked early enough here is that people have not taken this public health crisis seriously enough in the same way we take our military crises seriously enough. If we had prepared for this like a military crisis, we would be using the DPA and using it more effectively. Second, the president has waffled. He's been reluctant to use it. So he goes back and forth between using a market solution and trying to use the DPA. He's made governors paranoid that he's going to seize their products. It's just not working effectively. Third, there's a question of equitable distribution. Who's going to get the products? Where are they going to be sent? And how are we going to determine them? And fourth, this is my last comment, is that I want to just emphasize that there's a value judgment issue going on here. There's a way in which we are valuing people who are working and whether they need to be protected in this crisis. And the fact that we haven't taken this issue seriously enough says something very troubling about the lack of value we've attached to the safety of our healthcare workers and other essential workers. And I think hopefully one thing that will come out of this crisis is a new understanding of the rights and protections that healthcare workers need.
Okay, that's fantastic. I think all of us listening, if any of you ever get asked by your nearest and dearest, what is a DPA? You can now talk about it with confidence with that 4-part schema. But I'd like to bring in Professor Brinkley here and ask, you are a luminary in terms of looking at the sweep of American history and how the military has or has not been involved. Where did the DPA even come from? And has it been used in this way before? I mean, how do you frame the current events in this historical background?
Well, really, everything begins with Pearl Harbor. At that moment, when the Japanese bombed our Pacific Fleet in Hawaii, and we had that famous speech by FDR that this is a day that will live in infamy in front of a joint session of Congress. At that point, it was clear that we were going to, as FDR said, I was Dr. New Deal, now has to become Dr. Win the War. And in 1941, FDR got a War Productions Act passed, which said that there was a second one expanding it in 1942. And what the Defense Production and War Productions is that gets priority. To win the war, we may have to do rationing. People have gasoline rations, tire rations, even medicines that are rationed, that we've got to prioritize winning of the war. And FDR asked the whole country to take part in it. And it was a miracle. I mean, we didn't win World War II on Normandy and Iwo Jima. We won it in Detroit and Pittsburgh and New Orleans and Los Angeles. It was the industrial military movement and this idea of procurement between the government and private industries. FDR did it in a brilliant fashion. And one of the perks was you would go to, let's say, a musical instrument company in Connecticut. And the federal government would say, you are making trumpets and saxophones. We now need you to make ship valves. Wow. But after the war, we'll buy instruments from you and help you reconvert back to musical instruments, and we'll give you a government contract. Or a Massachusetts, Lowell or Lawrence, making textiles, let's say women's blouses. Suddenly they had to make silk parachutes, and then you had to reconvert them back. But it gave the president this enormous amount of power that Congress had given the president the power to decide what was needed and what's not. Now, after World War II, those ended. But Harry Truman and when North Korea invaded the South Korea in 1950, pushed through Congress what we're talking about today, the Defense Production Act. And it was a similar thing. Ironically, Truman never went and got a war declaration to fight in the Korean War, but he got a declaration for Defense Production Act, which brought the capacity of our industrial sector, the private sector, the big corporations into government. And since the Korean War, it's been done in a hit and miss fashion. Once in a while, it's invoked, but we're in a kind of World War II-like crisis. We're dealing with a new Great Depression environment. We have an enemy. President Trump calls it the invisible enemy. Let's call it that. But we've got to have a mask for doctors, surgical equipment. We need not just ventilators, but we need to create an entire kind of wartime structure. So people that have any sense of what FDR did are pleading with President Trump to really be vigorous with the Defense Production Act. Why hasn't he been, or why has it been like drip, drip? One, maybe I'll get GM to do some ventilators, then I won't. And it's been willy-nilly. It's been hard to understand a thread of what Trump's doing. And that's because he's afraid that it reeks of a kind of socialism, that it's something that FDR and liberals like, that the federal government is telling the corporate sector what to do. And Trump is allergic to that. He's doing it a little bit because the heat was on him so much, but I'm afraid he doesn't know how to mobilize in the way that FDR did during World War II.
Well, that is
But,
incredibly inspiring to be able to look back at history for a tangible example where it's actually been used. I'm kind of curious, though, briefly, in the last pandemic of 2018-19, when they didn't actually have a DPA, what happened then?
well, look, I would look at Bill Clinton's presidency. You know, President Clinton in the 1990s ended up, he's a voracious reader president. I don't think people realize how many books that man reads. But while he was president, he read Richard Preston's thriller novel called, first the one, The Hot Zone, and the second called The Cobra Effect. And it was all about what happens if a pandemic swept across the United States. Bill Clinton got very frightened from reading these books and actually met with Richard Pearson, the novelist. And then he called a meeting and had every single office start preparing for a pandemic to come. And it was Clinton in the 90s who started building our stockpiles of masks, surgical gowns, medicines in undisclosed warehouses all across the United States. And he found the money for it. It didn't make headline news. You don't read it on his Wikipedia of great things Bill Clinton did. But he really was starting to realize that that in the 90s, we were using the word globalization, that we were a global society and that viruses and bacteria were going to spread. Bill Clinton even created an intelligence agency around the world for bacteria and virus, including having a secret agents, if you like, in China to see what they were doing. But, you know, then 9/11 came and that thought of pandemics started dissipating and everybody was worried about terror attacks. And George W. Bush created Homeland Security and we started doing IDs and, you know, airports and port facilities. We did start preparing for terror, but we kind of got soft on things like we gutted FEMA, which we got punished for when Hurricane Katrina hit because we had defunded it. And we're starting to see George W. Bush got very worried and started trying to get white papers with National Security Council. Obama did. But when Trump came in, he saw pandemics as something that can be cut. And he started cutting CDC's budget and he started getting rid of, he got rid of a White House alert advisor on pandemics. He just didn't take it as a serious threat. And hence, he was caught unprepared earlier this year.
Professor Gluck here just for a moment, though, and just ask her, or Professor Brinkley, when you look at other countries, do they have things like the DPA that they can invoke, that they can actually bring in and quickly act? Do either of you have a view on that? Because can we look not just to history, but to other countries for inspiring examples of what can be done quickly now?
I think I have heard that other countries invoke their DPA equivalents much earlier than we did. That's why sometimes you hear about friends in Asia who have access to a lot of masks. It doesn't mean we don't have that capacity. We had those levers. It means that we didn't turn them on early enough. We didn't take the threat seriously.
Again, we checked out a few local hotspots like Barton Springs.
I can hear someone else coming in. Hey, Professor Brinkley, do you have any thoughts on that about other countries which we can look to for examples?
I think you just have to look at the United States. I mean, we had a system in place, but what happened from the stockpiling is that they get antiquated, the mask, and then part of the arrangement is they would be given as gifts, donations to hospitals, but we didn't replenish and restock. And for the Defense Production Act, any country, I mean, you know, look, in our country, I mean, Lincoln used executive power to emancipate slaves. I mean, at times habeas corpus gets you know, I mean, we are in a huge crisis, so you have to use everything you can. The Defense Production Act is still there on the books for us to use, but you know, it's about presidential leadership and the failure of it, in my view, by Donald Trump. We're seeing how Germany responded in South Korea and other countries. We seem far behind. Can we make this up? Yes, and that's why I'm not talking today. We've got to start mass producing masks. We've got to start using the Defense Production Act more. We need to be a leader for ventilators, masks, surgical gowns, not just in our country, but the world. We blew it early on in the COVID-19 crisis, but we have a chance for recovery if we can start showing that what other countries can do to start merging private sector, corporations, and government now and in the future to be much more prepared. We're still only in phase 1 of this thing right now,
well,
so it's not too late.
That is a great moment on which to end. Thank you, Professor Gluck, for explaining it so clearly, what many of us were grappling to understand. Thank you, Professor Brinkley, for putting in such a fantastic historical sweep. And thank you both for really giving a very rousing call for arms for all of us. And let's hope that the leadership is listening properly. So thank you. I'm now going to be turning over to a video before my friend Steve Leisman, the CNBC maestro, comes on. So over to the video.